Yeah. Thank you all. As I was telling Derek last night, I haven't taught for about 5 years. I taught one little class, but that was it. So after teaching for 25 years, I started teaching in 1982. So I don't know, I'm a little rusty, but I'm really glad to kind of give this a whirl again. I spent 5 years locked away writing 2 books, and now a third. By the time it's done, it'll all be about 800,000 words. So that doesn't give you a lot of time for anything else. I've been kind of inside the process, really, very intensely for a long time. So this gives me a chance to kind of, I don't know, talk about it a little bit and give you an idea of where I come from. So anyway, thank you for this chance. Please bear with me. I'm going to embark upon some pretty wild free association, and none of this is provable or supportable, so there will be no questions when this is done. So if you have read the title of this talk, which was very long and I'm not sure I remember it at this moment, you know this is going to be sort of an info dump on a range of topics, all having something to do. This thing is squeaking a little bit, isn't it?
Yeah, I better turn it down.
I'll give it a minute. How's that? Can you still hear me? Yeah. Okay. We really don't miss the talk because you can't keep it up here. As I said, sort of info dump on a range of topics all having to do with the elusive concept of meaning in fiction. And I will begin, as one must always when speaking in public, with a confession. Though I have come to be known as a writer of, for lack of a better term, commercial fiction, subcategory horror, I guess, this was not always so, nor was it anything that I planned. I started out as a purely literary writer, and I do indeed continue to see myself that way. Though my first 2 novels and my second 2 novels are indeed shelved in very different places in the store, that is a distinction that is made by the marketplace, and it is wholly unrelated to the process by which I undertook the writing of them, which in each instance was identical. I got an idea, I worked it out into a story, I wrote the best story I could in the amount of time I had before I couldn't pay my bills. My reading tastes are the same. Almost exclusively, I read literary fiction. I will pause here to offer a couple of useful definitions. Literary fiction is fiction written to be respected, and commercial fiction is fiction written to sell. Genre is something completely different, as I will come to. Sometimes both things happen, respect and money, but not very often, as we know, and of course, most of the time, neither thing happens. Flannery O'Connor, who was the wisest woman to ever walk the earth, was once asked if she felt that MFA programs discouraged too many young writers. To the contrary, she said, "I don't think it discourages enough of them." It is true, most books are bad. I have written several bad ones. Bad art, bad commerce, just bad, bad, bad. So I do my best to avoid reading them, and generally, though not always, this sends me to the literary shelves for what I choose to read. At public events, and I do a lot of readings and talks and things like that, readers often frame their questions to me with references to books and writers who, in their opinion, clearly have influenced my work, but whom, to nearly a one, I have never actually heard of. I know very little about the current state of fantasy or science fiction, and when asked to name my favorite horror writer, I always answer Edgar Allan Poe. So right now you're thinking this guy's a bit of a snob, I guess, and I probably am, but my prejudices have very little to do with content. In fact, a lot of literary novels bore me cross-eyed, just as many commercial novels leave me feeling like I've been eating nothing but Funyuns for a week. This brings me finally to the question of meaning, and thus, inevitably, as all things must go, to my father-in-law's basement. I believe I mentioned this in the title of the talk, did I not? My father-in-law's basement. A number of years ago, and this is an important part of my education as a writer, before I started the passage, circumstances placed me for an extended period at my in-laws' house in Minneapolis. This was in the emotionally deflated aftermath of publishing my second novel, The Summer Guest. Now, after I finish a book, I tend to spend some period of time acting very much like a person with PTSD. My energy and attention span are about zilch. I wear my bathrobe long past the appropriate hours of the day. I was actually in my bathrobe upstairs until about an hour ago. And this is something my wife hates to hear me say, but it is absolutely true. Going back to my office feels like revisiting the scene of my own rape. During these periods, I actually mostly just read when I'm not watching Hoarders or Ice Loves Coco, which are very good shows. And the time I'm speaking of, my state of mind was such that I wanted nothing to read that seemed even remotely challenging. No doorstop novels by dead Russians. I wanted a literary diet of pure junk food, and as luck would have it, I was in my in-laws' house, which is smack dab in the middle of the junk food aisle. My father-in-law is, or was, he's retired now, a purchasing manager for 3M, and has bankrolled more frequent flyer miles than anybody I've ever read. He's rather like the George Clooney character in Up in the Air. For a better part of 30 years, he traveled at least once a month to Asia, usually to purchase, to negotiate a deal with a factory to purchase 10,000 miles of small surgical tubing, things like that. As far as I can tell, he spent most of that time with his nose in a book. My father-in-law is what you would call a man of the people, an ex-Marine from central Minnesota who shovels his driveway and mows his lawn before his neighbors are even awake. And his literary tastes are thoroughly democratic. His basement is full of paperback novels of the sort that sell by the pallet load at Walmart. Lawyer novels, cop novels, cowboy novels, spy novels, you get the drift. Every book in his basement has been read exactly once. Most, though not all, were written by men. If you ask my father-in-law about any particular title in his possession, his response will be the same. It was pretty good. The last thing I want to do is to give the impression that my father-in-law ought to read more challenging books, or that I'm a better person than he is because I haven't read everything that John Grisham ever wrote. To the contrary, my father-in-law is actually a very smart man, and his literary tastes are defined less by aesthetic preference than the ergonomic realities of his life. I think he'd probably get a bang out of Graham Greene, for example, but they don't sell Graham Greene in airports, or if they do, it's buried in the back, which is far too much trouble when you're hustling to catch your connecting flight from Seattle to Taiwan. Whenever I recommend a title to him, he reads it instantly and calls me to tell me what he thought of it. Not long ago, I suggested that he might like the stylish spy novels of Alan Furst and loaned him a copy of my favorite, The Polish Officer. Do any of you know Alan Furst's writing? Oh, you really should. Furst is, for my money, not just our best spy novelist, but one of our best writers of historical fiction. All of his books are set in occupied France or the Balkans during the early years of the Third Reich, and they are so saturated with the atmospheres of the period that you can practically smell the Gaulois smoke coming off the pages. His sentences are models of clarity and elegance, and his characters, they're not spies in the traditional sense, but ordinary people forced by circumstances into acts of profound courage. Many aren't sure who they are working for and what, if anything, they are accomplishing by blowing up the bridge or smuggling the stolen documents across the border, a fact which magnifies their heroism 100-fold because they sort of seem like me. I love these novels unreservedly. They are espionage novels, as I said, but they are also literature. My father-in-law thinks so too, and since I gave him my beloved copy of The Polish Officer, he has read every first novel that I have sent him, and there are quite a few. But in the meantime, in those months gorging on junk food, I too encountered books that I would have to concede were full of pretty goodness. I am not immune to the charms of a well-executed plot, and nearly all of these books had something to recommend them. My father-in-law does not go in for untested authors, and even the clumsiest writer learns a thing or two over time. John Grisham, for instance, knows nothing about women. I'm glad I'm not married to him. But he knows a lot about greed, and he does a great job with setting, especially the Delta South, where a lot of his books are set. Michael Crichton, whom I've read since I was a kid, really, I think the first grown-up novel I ever read, which was the 5th grade, was The Andromeda Strain. He is just as flat-footed when it comes to the more nuanced aspects of characterization, and he is a terrible self-plagiarist. All his tales are basically the same, Run, nerds, run. But the questions that he raises, I must say, about the dangers of science for its own sake are very compelling and serious. A few of the books that I read were flat out stupid, and one or two were morally repellent, like snuff movies. I can only wonder why so many popular novels have to begin with a scene in which a woman is, say, stabbed in the eyeballs by a sex criminal. But even the worst ones were, in their own ways, faithfully executed entertainments. Manipulative, melodramatic, gross, but still I turned the page. And yet, something happened to me as I read these books, something that I hadn't expected at all. I will note again that it had been years since I'd read a book that I understood going in was going to ignore the more subtle concerns of human existence that preoccupy me both as a writer and as a person. I wasn't expecting art, but I was anticipating escapism, some departure from my life. And it is true that very few of these novels resembled my life in any way. Very few of the books I read contained characters or situations that seemed middle class. Very few contained marriages that looked remotely like my own. In fact, a very high percentage of the characters were divorced. Few of them contained children except the ones who were kidnapped by maniacs or used as sentimental props. Nobody worried about their 401k or their leaky rain gutters or how to pay for their daughter's violin lessons, and nobody ever did any household chores. And I don't know about you, but half my life is household chores. The sex was always sensational and life-changing. The weather was always sunny or raining very hard. The billfolds were always full. In other words, these novels did exactly what they promised to do, putting aside dull reality on behalf of something far more glamorous and exciting. And yet, as I read them, I found my attention wandering to precisely those aspects of my life that these books chose not to include and wanted me to forget. Half of my mind might have been sitting on stakeout or striding across the lobby of a luxury hotel with a briefcase full of cash, such as the Hilton in Lexington, Kentucky, but the other half was still thoroughly immersed in my corporeal existence, computing my tax bill and planning my next trip to Costco. The problem with these books wasn't that they were technically genre titles, a word I find pretty meaningless when it comes to assessing the quality of a book. Everything belongs to a genre. The Odyssey is arguably the best road novel ever written. My love for Alan First is a matter of record, and I've described it. I'll put Lonesome Dove up against any novel by a dead Russian for sheer storytelling balls. And I think the first 100 pages of Dennis Lehane's Mystic River are as good as anything Dreiser ever wrote. Nor do I harbor any prejudice against genre for its own sake. I grew up on a steady diet of science fiction, Heinlein, Clarke, Bradbury, all the rest. And though I don't read much or even any science fiction these days, you will find me in line, first in line, at the multiplex for pretty much any movie involving, as my wife puts it, outer space shit. The problem with these books, I decided, was this. They didn't mean anything. When I speak of capital M meaning in fiction, I realize I am using a term that for the most part writers actually avoid, even though it sits at the heart of what we do. In my own years as an MFA student, and I did have them way back in the 80s, which is a time, of course, when we're supposed to get these things talked out, I don't think I heard the word meaning used once. Just as I never heard the word plot used, because it was the 80s. Readers use the word meaning all the time, but what they are generally referring to is theme, some arena of ideas that a book takes up, such as love or parenting or religion. So what do I mean by meaning? I wish I knew, but like pornography, I know it when I see it. For me, the best synonym for meaning would be fullness, the psychological impression that the world of the book we are reading is as rich as the world we actually live in. I don't know about you, but I think that it means something to be alive, to walk the earth, to be a human being. I'm thoroughly agnostic, and it's been years since I participated in anything like an organized religion, but I am nevertheless a person of faith in the broad sense. Taking a run on a summer afternoon, or smelling my children's hair, or listening to Keith Jarrett play My Wild Irish Rose, I am convinced that our physical existence is an expression of some invisible, transcendent reality. I don't know what it is, but I feel it all around me. And it is this feeling, above all, that made me want to be a writer in the first place, and that may be you. In other words, for a novel or story to mean anything, it can't just look like the world, it has to feel like the world too. This is a tall order, of course, the one that keeps the writers up way past their bedtimes. How do you replicate the full-bodied texture of existence, both physical and metaphysical? How do you create the feeling of being alive, to be matter in a universe of matter, to be a soul in a universe of souls? I know how God, whoever she is, did it. She did it with atoms, energy, and time. Pity the poor writer, all we have is language. So I'll now embark on the mad scientist portion of the talk. For some time now, both as a writer and as a teacher who has to explain these things to people, or do at least do the best I can, I have been considering the ways in which the physical patterns that govern the actual world find correspondent in the rhetorical structures that we use to write a story or a novel. I am not a physicist or mathematician. I can barely balance my checkbook, not that anybody even bothers with that anymore. But I took enough of this sort of stuff in high school and a little bit in college to grasp the basics and see how they might apply to the trade of fiction. And think about it, why shouldn't they? A novel or short story is a highly organized, very compact reality. It is, let's say, a reality of the mind, but it is a reality nonetheless, one that we are hoping the reader can experience for the duration of the telling. And as such, it ought to behave pretty much like the physical world we all profess to live in. In fact, this kind of thinking is actually old hat if you consider Aristotle's dramatic unities of space, time, and action. What is it if not physics 101 applied to the imaginary reality of the stage? A lot, though, has happened in physics since the golden age of Athenian drama. Two big things, actually. The first big thing was Isaac Newton. Newtonian physics is, do we have any physicists in our room? Great. All right. Newtonian physics is the kind of physics one learns in high school, which is where I learned it. It describes the operation of matter, objects, at the observable and Aristotelian level. It's basically a rule book for surface reality. Our intuitive sense of Newtonian physics is what enables us, for instance, to parallel park the car, put the 8-ball in the corner pocket, to know that we will not actually drop the baby, even though our wife is screaming at us to stop horsing around like that. In terms of literary artifice, Newtonian thinking does a very good job handling certain fairly obvious aspects of literary form. Point of view, for instance, has a basically Newtonian nature. It possesses a position in time and space from which it observes and perhaps comments on the action of a story, and its comings and goings float on the surface of the story and are governed by its rules. Plot is absolutely Newtonian, as mechanical as a mousetrap. You take an object at rest, the ordered state of affairs at the beginning of a story or novel, you introduce energy, some complication in the lives of the characters, and the result, in Newtonian terms, is work, an object that's discharging energy which takes the form of movement, heat, and light, all of things that you want in a fiction. You apply countervailing force, the object comes to rest once more, and the novel is over. The problem with this model of fiction writing is that it doesn't cover everything. Obedience to the surface mechanics does not create meaning. It only builds a house that meaning can inhabit. Michael Crichton, as an example, and you can choose your own, is an engineer of perfect Newtonian entertainments, but they don't feel alive. This is because they take no account of the deeper organizing patterns that make existence not merely predictable and tolerable, but also splendid. There's a place where physics becomes theology, and he just doesn't go there. This line of thinking led me, God help us all, to Einstein, whose theories of the relationship between matter and energy seem to me to hold something like an answer to this question. Einstein belonged to the first generation of modern physicists to interrogate the question of what existence actually is, to describe the unseen forces that stitch it together. My first encounter with Einstein came in junior high school in the form of the illustration that I passed out. Do you guys have it? There's a sheet of paper, it's got a couple of definitions on it, but it also has a picture, right? This is an image of the curvature of space-time in the vicinity of an object of significant mass. This, I was told in junior high, was gravity, a kind of dip or bend that takes place around things. Large things, of course, planet-sized things, but also small things, even subatomic things. It's a perfect illustration because you don't really have to understand it to feel its rightness. Every science museum has something to demonstrate the principle, and I think viscerally, and it's a device called a gravity well. You also see them in penny arcades, but it's a staple of the science museum where you take your kids on a rainy Sunday. It's essentially a large funnel. Children put marbles or coins in the rim. I'm sure everybody knows these things, right? And the objects spin around, going faster and faster as they make their descent before disappearing down the hole at the center. The most interesting thing about these devices is the kind of really familiar beauty they create when a lot of marbles are going around and around, interacting with each other by virtue of their private interaction with the slope of the funnel and the accelerating force that's pulling them towards the hole and therefore also to the center of the earth. When I see one of these things, I can't help but think of music, actually, the way all the instruments of an orchestra seem to be speaking to one another while also responding to some essential melodic line. I draw music into this because I believe human expression in any art form, which is, of course, roughly speaking, the attempts by human beings to make meaning and beauty, is basically the same and follows the same general principles. Good art is held together through good art is held together through an investigation not only into the observable mechanics of matter and energy, but also the forces that stitch these things together into a richer relationship. In a good work of art, whether it's a short story or a symphony or a poem or a painting, we have the feeling that everything in it is related to everything else, and that the meaning of the work of art lives in that relationship. In other words, fiction needs gravity the way the cosmos needs gravity. Gravity is the soul of the fiction machine. So while I was thinking about Einstein, I was also thinking about the idea of metaphor, by which I mean not street-level metaphor, my love is a wild, wild rose, but the larger idea of subsurface meaning in fiction, whereby certain details become much larger than they really are by virtue of their interaction with other adjacent details, other marbles in the funnel. This subsurface level of a fiction, it seemed to me, was rather like the gravitational force of Einstein's illustration. This was where the whole thing was held together, where the soul of the fiction was. For a long time, I actually struggled as a writer with the whole idea of metaphor and symbolism, because I believed, as many do when they are starting out, that such things are conscious and deliberate installations in a fiction. You make a symbol when it's time for one, and you go and you get it at some place probably called the Symbol Boutique. I believed this as a young writer, but it is also true, of course, that I never did it successfully. If meaning is the binding force of a fictional universe, then a symbol, something with extra meaning, can't come from outside that fabric. Like the bend in space-time around a planet, it's intrinsic, as gravity is intrinsic. Now, this question led me, and again, this talk is made of a series of completely preposterous leaps, to remember a dream I once had. Other people's dreams, like their pets, are the most boring subject in the world. But I will risk telling this on this occasion because I think it has some use, and I often refer to this as the dream that saved my fiction life. This dream, a weird, unpleasant dream, occurred a number of years ago, right before I came up for tenure at the university where I was teaching. This was the Sal College in Philadelphia, where I taught for 10 years before I went to Rice. This was basically a dream of sexual betrayal, right out of the Sexual Betrayal Dream Handbook. I believed in the dream with passionate certainty that my wife was having an affair. At the time I had this dream, my wife was teaching freshman writing. I like to say friends don't let friends teach freshman writing. At the college where she worked, which was different from my own, she had acquired a reputation amongst the Asian student community, most of whom spoke English as a second language, as especially sympathetic and helpful. As a consequence, her classes were packed with Korean, Vietnamese, and Chinese students. Now, in my dream, this fact was condensed into a single invented person, a Chinese-American colleague who was a new member of her department. No such person actually existed. Now, this was all sort of in the background. My dream was cluttered and chaotic for a while, as most dreams are, until finally it settled down into a scene in which, humiliating and despairing, I confronted my wife with the accusation of her infidelity. "Who is it?" I demanded. "Who is this man you're seeing?" And at once she burst into tears. "It's you," she cried. "It's Professor Yu." For those of you who do not get the joke. Right? You, Professor Yu. Right. So, in other words, my wife was having an affair with me. Interestingly, I didn't understand this dream until later in the morning when I told my wife about it, who laughed. To her, the joke was obvious, and she quickly decoded it. What seemed to be a dream about romantic infidelity was actually a dream rooted in my own professional anxieties. Professor Yu. I was cuckolding myself by betraying my hopes and aspirations as a writer by trading them for the golden shackles of a tenured academic job. My mind was borrowing certain facts from my life, my wife's job, her popularity with Asian students, the fact that her work life was largely unknown to me and therefore completely fertile ground for paranoia, as pieces, as vehicles for expressing this anxiety. What was most interesting to me, though, was the way that the dream so methodically, elegantly constructed its narrative on behalf of its great final pun. The whole thing was a beautifully built joke made of language. My conscious mind could never have accomplished this. It's just not nimble enough. But the unconscious mind, the dreamer's mind, has a special genius for this kind of thing. An actor making specific dramatic shapes out of emotional turbulence and infusing these made-up dramas with organized symbolic patterns, quite sophisticated, that support its meaning. For the unconscious mind, building a dream like the one I had is just another day at the office. So as a writer, awake, not sleeping, how do you get access to this stuff? How does it find its way in your work to create that strong, symbolic, rhetorical substrata, that gravity? I would argue that you actually can't avoid it. Writers, like every artist, rely on the unconscious mind. The creation of any work of art doesn't commence as a conscious or tactical enterprise. Everybody in the room knows this. The making of a story, a novel, a miniature world of fact and feeling depends on conscious decision-making, a sparkling awareness of literary form and its Newtonian mechanics. But as every artist knows, as everybody in the room knows, a great deal of this work is done intuitively, is it not? Things just seem to find their way of their own accord into your stories, and to do so again and again. Certain turns of language, certain physical objects, certain dramatic situations. In the stories of Raymond Carver, for instance, you will find again and again moments when characters receive disturbing or incoherent phone calls, instances of objects stuck in tubes, images of compartments and containers, many of them disturbingly coffin-like, dried-up things, fat people, unappealing babies like the ugly baby in Seinfeld, prophets, and so on. It's actually a very long list. In Carver's work, you will find that many of these images are so prevalent that they actually overlap, so that you have fat babies, dried up things in compartments, prophetic phone calls to people stuck in small places. All writers do this because all people do this. You might say that writers are simply more in touch with the imagistic junk that fills their brains. As a writer, I like to think of this material as my psychic stuff. Sometimes you know where this stuff, these obsessions, come from, and sometimes you don't. Why did Carver write so many stories with incoherent phone calls from strangers? There's actually a story there that Carver told. There was a certain dark, unhappy summer of his life around the time that his first marriage failed and he was drinking himself basically to death, that he received a string of wrong number phone calls in the middle of the night. The voice on the other end would always plead, "Nelson, Nelson, is that you?" The collision of these details, the phone calls, and then also the name Nelson, which he used in the story Vitamins, for those of you who know it, and the sorrows of that summer, all of them became the raw material that he used to build any number of stories about alcoholism, loneliness, terror, divorce, and loss. My dream of Professor Yu operated the same way. A number of things on my mind were assembled into an organized narrative by my unconscious mind as I slept. So here's the point I'm attempting to make. The subtle and interesting patterns, the meaningful repetitions and echoes that we find in well-made short stories and novels resemble the same sorts of patterns we find in dreams, because stories, like dreams, are constructed at the outset by the unconscious mind. You sit down to write a story about your relationship with your father, and you look up to find that your draft is full of Easter eggs, people stirring pots in kitchens, and things bouncing off hard objects, a bird into a window, a tennis ball off a wall, and a minor car crash. At the level of the story's initial creation, when you're just kind of writing your way through the thing, as we all do, you probably had no particular awareness of these repetitions, just as I didn't understand my dream of Professor Yu until my wife, acting as a stand-in for my conscious mind, that's her job, explained it to me. But the fact remains that you put these things in your story for a reason, even if you don't understand it yet. And they are almost certainly related both to each other and to the real subject of your story, which probably is not about you and your dad at all. Learning to recognize this kind of pattern making, both to harness it initially, to kind of get it going, and then to control it as you redraft and refine your work, is the heart of what everybody in this room tries to do. It's through the unconscious mind's Einsteinian creation and the conscious mind's Newtonian manipulation of that creation that you can bring meaningful patterns to bear on your work, that deep, intrinsic fabric of fictional reality that those books in my father-in-law's basement did not possess. Stories are made of people and events, but also of things, and most especially, and this is obvious, but it has to be said, stories are full of language. Your unconscious mind knows this. It's the voice that's telling you to write a story in the first place, and it provides, if you let it, all the raw material that you need to write a narrative of organic unity and professional urgency. The last is important. You have to write what your brain wants you to write with the material that it gives you to write it. My brain knew I was worried about accepting tenure and what this was going to do to me. It gave me Professor You to express and interrogate that fear. As I used to tell my students, and I guess I'm telling students now, your unconscious mind knows what's eating you better than you do and how to tell a story about it. So ignore your unconscious at its peril. This process of building from the unconscious is the source of what is generally meant by the word symbolism. Now herein lies the sort of school teacherish part of my talk. Symbolism takes two forms. One of them is dead and one of them is alive. The first one, the dead one, is called natural symbolism. And forgive me if you already know all of this stuff. A natural symbol is something that means what it means, regardless of its context. This meaning derives unavoidably from the natural world, a degree of psychological or physical literalism, or ancient or mythological texts. The cross, for instance, is a natural symbol of sacrifice and redemption. 2,000 years of cultural history just makes it that way. The sun and the moon are natural symbols. The sun is masculine, the moon feminine. An empty seesaw is a natural symbol. Oh, where have the children gone? I say that natural symbolism is dead because, generally speaking, for the writers of short stories and novels, its meaning is non-negotiable, static, and familiar. It seems to come from outside the story, outside the fabric of its intrinsic reality, and therefore has no gravity. The second form of symbolism, far more interesting, is what is generally known as literary symbolism. I like to call this form of symbolism something else. I like to call it added value meaning, or AVM. These are extra layers of meaning associated with an action or object in a story that are dependent entirely upon the immediate narrative and linguistic context. In other words, they wouldn't mean what they mean unless they were in that story at that moment. Think again of the gravity well device. It's nothing interesting at all until there are lots of coins or marbles in it. And this interest comes from the way in which these objects move together. One marble is boring, 20 marbles is interesting. A literary symbol may derive its added meaning in part from its natural symbolic properties, but the majority of its weight in the text, its gravitational force, flows from the characters that interact with it, because they, like the writer, are responsive to this meaning and participate in making it. And I will give you an example. At the end of the story, Thanksgiving Day by Susan Minot. Whatever happened to Susan Minot? Is she still out there? Yeah, she's a wonderful writer. She wrote a terrific, really one of the best first books of stories I ever read, published in maybe 1983 or 4, called Monkeys. It was a group of linked stories, a form I love. In Thanksgiving Day, which is one of the early stories in the collection, an empty rocking chair by the fire suggests the impending death of the family patriarch, an alcoholic bully with dementia. Now, a rocking chair is a natural symbol of age, and its vacancy is a natural symbol of death. Not very interesting, pretty obvious. The rocking chair achieves that extra level of AVM, however, when the grandmother stops its empty rocking with her foot. Like the reader, she is also a receptor of the chair's meaning. By bringing its motion to a halt, which is the story's terminal moment, its final moment, she reveals that her husband's impending death is a painful reality she doesn't want to think about, regardless of the fact that he is an alcoholic bully. At this moment, her character and her pain are revealed, the story kind of turns backwards on itself, and its meaning is enlarged. You can love somebody you also hate. This brings me to the big enchilada of metaphor, and I think this was maybe in the title of the talk as well. This is what I like to call the story's deep well of gravity. The writer John Cheever said that a short story was a durable literary shape because its episodic nature corresponded to the episodic nature of life. I'm sure you've heard this before. It is true that a whole human life, birth to death, feels like a novel, but the interesting and important things that happen along the way to us, feel like stories. I mention this just to make the point that literary form itself, the idea of a novel or a short story, is not arbitrary. Form tidies things up a bit. Literature is far more organized than life itself, but the basic shapes that it employs correspond to the geometries of human experience. The whole idea of a plot, for instance, the story's surface ordering of events, finds correspondence in the way that time feels while we're actually living it. Beginning, middle, end, rest, unrest, reordered rest, morning, noon, and night. Plot is basically linear and organized in patterns of 3, punctuated by intervals of intense change, just like our lives are. But what kind of geometry governs the substrata, the unconscious patterning of metaphor and meaning? A story's subsurfic logic behaves differently than its surface ordering, I've found. Its organization is far less governed by chronology. It's full of small, non-linear motions and activities of language, of meaning and effect. I like to think of it this way. The surface of the story is made of lines. The substrata are built of arcs, circles, and orbits. In other words, the organic form that governs the meaning of the story, not just its surface story, the meaning of the story, is cosmological, gravitational, and planetary, a nexus of orbits, spinning coins in the well, everything in organized motion at all times. And governing this motion is one thing, a moment, an object, an action, a turn of phrase that acts as the organizing presence within this miniature cosmos. And this, of course, is the hole at the bottom of the funnel, which I call, obviously, the story's deep well of gravity. A story's deep well of gravity is usually a thing, but remember, like everything else in a story, it's a thing made of language. It's through this one thing that everything in the story is related to everything else. Take this one thing out, and your space-time construction falls apart, implodes, everything collapsing, whirling away into nothing. Here's the good news. Every story or novel you write probably has a deep well somewhere in it. You may not know what it is. You may have failed to recognize its importance and to build a sturdy cosmos around it, but it's there because it represents to your unconscious mind, which is the real boss, your whole reason for writing the story you've written in the first place. It is Professor You. Your job as a writer is to bring that deep well into its proper position, to know what it is and be aware of it, because it's never hidden. It's never anything the reader should miss. As a writer of both short stories and novels, I try to make myself aware of how this principle applies to both forms, and I'm not kidding when I say that I sit down anytime I write something and I use this language and talk to myself about it so that I know how it's running the show. The first thing I will say is that the idea of the gravity well applies to both novels and short stories. It's tempting to think that a novel is too large to rely on just one object or moment to afford it a feeling of subsurface unity. I thought so myself until I realized how stupid that was. If anything, a novel needs a deep well even more than a short story does to draw its huge debris field into a meaningful arrangement. The difference is simply a matter of positioning and occasionally size. Here's a good example. Mrs. Dalloway, a novel that I love, that I read 3 times in college for 3 different courses and that taught me to be a writer, is a novel that is about as cluttered as anything ever written. A book that would fail completely without a deep well to provide an organizing gravitational attraction between its elements. Moving back and forth, I'm sure people have read this book, right? Mrs. Dalloway is an old song, right? Moving back and forth between the consciousnesses of nearly 24 characters, many of them just walk-ons, things that your editor would hate, the novel is built entirely of the recorded interactions between individual human minds and the visible world. What Woolf described as a shower of atoms. That's how she described her book. As much as I love that novel, I'm pretty sure it would be an unreadable rainstorm of detail without Big Ben, whose routine appearance in the text, bonging out the hours, builds a baseline against which the rest of the text functions as a kind of melody. Big Ben tells us what the story is about. It's the hours, stupid, and that was originally the title of the novel. And when, at the end of the book, Clarissa Dalloway's plotline converges with Septimus Smith's, we feel the inevitability of this convergence, its absolute rightness and necessity, because the sound of Big Ben washing over London has been connecting these two strangers all along. An especially instructive example of this principle can be found in the story that was just passed out, Marcy Hirschman's wonderful short story, The Guillotine. And I urge you to read it after the talk to see if you think anything I say about it is true or complete nonsense. It's also out of print, I think, so this is your chance. I heard her speaking on NPR sometime in the mid-'80s about this book, which is called Tales of the Master Race. And I went and I read it, I loved it so much I went and found her. How do I find this woman? And she taught it tough, so became one. I call The Guillotine a short story, but it's also a chapter. The book from which it is taken is a novel in stories built of freestanding narratives that could be read alone, but when taken together add up to a novel, and in this case it's a sort of a panoramic novel. The setting of Hirschman's book is the town of Greifswald, Germany, during the first years of the Third Reich. Its characters are ordinary Germans who are drawn slowly but surely into complicity with the evils of that regime. The Guillotine is the first story in the book. Its specific setting is the town's centrally located police station, where a young newlywed named Torgud works as a clerk. The story is pretty much a straightforward story of betrayal within a marriage, not altogether unlike my dream of Professor Yu. Torgud's wife, his new wife, is the pretty Gerda. Although happy in her marriage, across the length of the story, she is eventually seduced away from her husband by his boss, Rolf Tersken, the town's police captain and a member of the Nazi Party. He steals his wife. This seduction is accomplished through an exchange of expressive gifts. Even a casual reader will not miss the overarching metaphor. Hirschman employs the destruction of a marriage, of one marriage, as a dramatic encapsulation of the seductive power of evil, especially as it applies to the lives of ordinary Germans during the Nazi period. In fact, the story, and this is why I used to use it so much in teaching, is completely saturated with symbols of every kind. In a different story, this might seem artificial, but in Hirschman's, it is also part of the story's naturalistic texture. Living under a totalitarian regime, the newlyweds Torgud and Gerda, like every other Aryan in the town of Greifswald, have become extremely skillful at speaking to one another in the symbolic language of their private marital codes. When, for instance, Torgud comes home from work with a haircut at the beginning of the story, his boss, in a gesture of complete sadism, always cuts his hair with the office shears on the day a prisoner is being beheaded in the station's basement. Gerda responds by giving her husband a bowl of stew to give to his boss. She might just as well write him a note that says, "Please don't kill my husband." Like the citizens of all police states, they have learned how to say something without actually saying it, using a symbolic language. The story's dramatic movement is actually defined by these kinds of symbolic transactions, and in particular by the gifts that Gerda and Tersken, her husband's boss, begin to sneakily trade across its length. Her gifts to her husband's boss and would-be lover are all domestic: food, needlework, the kinds of things that represent the sorts of services that a wife of the period would offer to a husband. Erskine replies with gifts that advance the conversation. He offers her both matching domestic duties. He washes the pot containing the meal that she sends, and then, most tellingly, the black market luxuries, a chocolate torte, a fur stolen hat, that a prosperous, well-connected provider would offer his wife. At one particular telling moment in the story, Gerda drops her glove on the snow for Erskine to find. A glove, an image of her hand in marriage. Do these characters know exactly what they're saying when they make these exchanges? Yes and no. Erskine does, but he's the seducer. Almost certainly Gerda doesn't at first. Meaning flows into these objects by circumstances, and one of the circumstances is the presence of the character's own unconscious minds in the world of the story. Gerda is flirting. She's toying with an idea. She doesn't know consciously yet what she wants until the end of the story. One of the pleasures of the story, if such a story can be said to contain pleasures, is watching Gerda's accumulating awareness of her own corruption. None of which would work at all if the story didn't have a deep well, a single object that everything else in the story moves around and pushes against. Hirschman doesn't hide her deep well at all. It's in the title, and literally right in the center of town, in the basement of the station. And of course, I'm speaking of the guillotine. The unseen guillotine of the story, and it's never observed directly, exerts a powerful force at all levels on the characters, on the town, and on the reader too. The guillotine isn't used to execute Jews or high-profile political dissidents. It's used to execute ordinary Germans on trumped-up charges. Its rumored existence keeps the people of the town in line. Nobody wants to be the next neck in its yoke. Torgood's extra proximity to it as a clerk in the station, and he can actually hear it working through the floor on the days of the execution, makes him an extra compliant and obedient servant of the Third Reich. That he doesn't have to observe any executions directly enables him to continue with his life as a husband and clerk, but of course it also ruins him morally and personally. This is how a police state operates. Execute a few average citizens, let everyone else know this, but not directly, so that they can ignore what they actually know, and they will take the path of least resistance, leading them eventually into full complicity with the regime and its evil. The guillotine is the story's deep well. Here we find all of the meanings of the story rolled into one. It's as if the guillotine were a kind of power plant that turns on all the lights in Hirschman's story. This is a story about things being severed. Husband from wife, work from home, past from present, good from evil, head literally from heart. The blade of the guillotine may not fall on Torgood's neck, but in a way it also does. By the end of the story, the cheerful, helpful newlywed he once was has been resected, replaced by a kind of zombie, a moral corpse. In a later story in the book, we find that he's become, of course, a willing servant of the Reich, someone capable of actually pulling the trigger. And because the guillotine is present, everything else in the story is pulled into a relationship with the idea of things being cut. Consider, again, Gerda's glove on the snow. It's a flirtatious gesture, really, something close to a prank, but it's also the image of a severed hand. Certain items of clothing, unworn, still retain the image of a body part, and a glove is one of these. Think also of the piles of shoes at Washington's Holocaust Museum, all of them eerily unoccupied by feet. I used to teach this story every single semester. Despite repeated public dissections, it never failed to give me the chills. I'm yet to find a better piece of writing on the subject of corruption. when in the story's final scene, Gerda puts on the fur stole sent by her Nazi lover, stroking its rich surface and murmuring her pleasure, all the evils of human history caress the reader like an Arctic wind. For that one moment, I think of nothing else. Not my tax bill, or my kids' grade in math, not the dinner I have to cook, or the bills I have to pay. Unlike the novels in my father-in-law's basement, I enter the world of this story completely. I am pulled down its well, and when the final sentence releases me, I'm left in a state I can only describe as a deeper inhabitation of my life. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what art is supposed to do. And I'll stop there. Like I said, read it and tell me if you think I'm wrong or right or not. You want to do some questions? Do some time? Yeah, I was kidding when I said no question. Just make them easy ones, okay? Anyone else? Three times. Yes, sir.
I know you run. Do you find that running is a way to sort of approximate an access to your subconscious?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I don't run so much anymore, actually. My knees probably caught up with me. I do other things, but it's the same idea. I think that artists are great auto-hypnotists. Right? This is not my idea, actually. It was first shared with me by the writer Madison Bell, who was one of my teachers in grad school, and we were talking about novels, and he wrote a whole book about hypnosis, actually. Hypnosis just brings the unconscious mind closer to the surface, right? As it turns out, I am incredibly suggestible. I've been hypnotized, and you can hypnotize me with a long, luscious look, pretty much. And when you are hypnotized, of course, the unconscious mind is closer to your conscious mind, right? And it can be manipulated and examined. And what, I think artists and writers are good at finding some way to do this. And hypnosis is usually achieved through some kind of basically repeated rhythmic state that's very relaxing, right? And that is, for me, has always been aerobic exercise. I was, as I said, a runner for many, many years. I still do some, but mostly, unfortunately, I'm relegated to awful-looking machines at the gym. But in my case, I've been lucky because my auto-hypnotic trick is one that it promotes, good health and long life, as opposed to getting really drunk, which is what many writers do instead, right? I think that's why, I don't think writers are maniacs and depressives. I think they're people who have a very destructive tool that they need to get access to their unconscious. But I do most of my good thinking in a state of basically aerobic endorphin high, and when I get all my thinking done that way, pretty much. I do all my thinking in motion. I get good ideas when I'm driving. I get good ideas when I'm taking a shower. That's sort of legendary, actually. The shower is a place where, because you're in a sort of freely associated state that is kind of physically pleasurable. Like, it's like your body feels a little different. And so I really do recommend finding a way to do this. I mean, you need a trick. You need a trick. And you need to adjust your brain chemistry to do it. And just, please do it in a way that doesn't kill you and, cause despair amongst your loved ones. So, yeah. The unconscious mind, learning to get a hold of it, very, very important. Because that's where all the crazy stuff comes from. That's where these unlikely connections that are just perfect come from. You cannot make them with your conscious mind. I really don't think that you can. I really don't think so. Yeah.
Okay, in your father-in-law's basement, and old Fred running through it, you turned him on to Alan first, and he started reading all the Alan first novels. Can you confess to having discovered somebody in his basement that you then went on to enjoy reading other novels?
No.
No.
I'm afraid that's a pretty straightforward answer. No. Yeah, I find most straight-up commercial fiction is, it's very repetitive, and it kind of doesn't do anything for me, and the characters are too thin. And on the other hand, I really like a great plot. Like I said, that too many literary writers forget why they want to be writers in the first place, which was usually a story with a great plot that they read when they were a kid. I mean, I grew up on a steady diet of these sort of mass market paperbacks of my era, because my reading diet was composed entirely of books I bought at the used paperback book sale that my elementary school had every year. And it was basically just the crap that people took off their shelves and sold. You pay like $5 and get a grocery sack full of books. So, I read Jaws and The Day of the Jackal And, you know, and I had no interest in, I didn't care about genre at all. I was just like, does this look interesting? Does this look exciting? And if it was, I liked it. If it wasn't, I didn't. I loved the watershed, and I spent a whole, those sort of books that you just kind of, you're inside them for a really long time. I would be shocked if there are fiction writers in the room who said they really decided they wanted to be a writer because they saw such a moving performance of Hamlet in high school. It's really very unlikely that that's where it started. That helps, believe me. I mean, I've learned an awful lot about this from Shakespeare, and anybody who's read my books know that I'm constantly referring to Shakespeare, who covered pretty much every major, like, important idea and plot that there is. Like, really, that's it. It's all there. You don't need to look anywhere else. But being inside a really great story is kind of what makes you want to be a writer in the first place. I went to graduate school in the 1980s, 87 to 89, during the heydays of minimalism, which I hope is kind of over. I don't really pay attention to these things much anymore. But in those days, we never talked about plot. There was no, the plot was a dirty word, right? We talked about tension. Does the story have tension, right? And you'd write a story where at the end somebody would drop a pie. And it was to mean something, right? And so I wasted a lot of time doing this, when in fact I was a complete slut for plot. I mean, that's what I loved, right? I wrote my college thesis on 1984, a novel that was in some ways sold as a commercial novel at its time. I was completely obsessed by Orwell for many years. I thought and I still think he's a genius. So the literary writers should learn from the commercial writers. The commercial writers very often need to go just spend more time writing their books. I mean, they're sloppy. I mean, they're just very sloppily written. The characters are thin, and the dialogue is totally predictable, and the settings are not well thought out, and the sort of mechanics of the world aren't being actually observed. There's so much baloney that you can see through. I do a lot of research for my books, and one of the things I try to do with The Passage and The 12 is tell as few outright fibs about the world as I can get away with. You can't get away with telling none. But, for instance, I learned a lot about firearms to write those books. My characters were constantly running around shooting things. And I was born in Massachusetts. I didn't know anything about guns. But I live in Texas, where conveniently, it's very easy to learn about guns. And so I learned a lot about guns, and I shoot a lot now. It's kind of fun. And I had my dentist teach me how to shoot sniper rifles. That was good. Only in Texas could you ask your dentist to do that. But, and I hired some other instructors. One of my instructors was, he'd been in the Israeli Defense Forces, right? That's a guy to teach you, okay? And I quickly learned how every presentation, every use of firearms in most of the novels I read, every television show and most movies is complete bullshit. It's complete bullshit. I was walking out of a movie theater with my daughter. We went to see The Hobbit. 500 hours I'm never getting back. And we walked out, and there was a big cardboard cutout for the Jack Reacher movie, which I guess is based on Lee Child's books. There's a picture of Tom Cruise, right? And my daughter wanted to take a shooting lesson. She's 16. I'm like, sure, let's go. She went, spent a day with the guy from the Israeli Defense Forces. It was really fun. And we walked by, and Tom Cruise is standing there, holding his gun and looking tough. And I looked at her and I said, "What's wrong with the picture?" And she said, "His finger's on the trigger." I said, "Exactly." Right? Like, you've learned your lessons well. Eli, our instructor, has taught me well. So. Anyway, I sort of departed into a bunch of things there, but there is a sort of feud between literary and commercial writers, and I am fortunately very often right in the middle of this fight, and I hate it. Right? I've never seen so much disrespect being exchanged. It's really terrible. I thought only poets were this mean to each other. My wife was a poet. Poets are brutal. Okay, like they're just. Are any poets in the room? Yeah, man, geez, you people, what is wrong with you? It's just terrible. But yeah, I've heard such ridiculous things being said. I mean, I heard a very popular, successful commercial writer talk about sort of just totally belittling Ian McEwan because he wishes he could sell as many books as I do, and I could just assure him that Ian McEwan does not. Okay, and he was being disrespectful to his betters. Right, Ian McEwan is better. I'm sorry, better. But again, I had my friend who didn't want to condescend to the reader of a zombie novel by using quotation marks or making it clear when and where we were. I'm like, dude, do you like The Walking Dead? It's pretty clear where they are. What's going on? Okay? I love The Walking Dead. I binged on 3 episodes last night. Shakespeare, The Walking Dead. That's me. The Many Moods of Justin. Okay.
What are you reading now?
I'm reading a book. What am I reading now? I'm reading Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. Yeah, and the new McEwen. I'm actually reading 3 books at the same time, which is really stupid, and I don't recommend it. I don't know. I sort of drifted into it because one of them was on a. I'm having trouble with my eyes actually, and so like what I read is determined very much by like what I can see right now, and because my prescription for these are trifles. My prescription for how strong they are just suddenly went radically way up because I got a problem with my optic nerve, and so I can only read a real book like for like half an hour because the print's too small, and I unfortunately get a lot of real books free. They just get sent to me all the time, and so I was reading McEwen's Sweet Tooth, right? But I can only do it at like 30 minutes at a pop because it's not an e-reader. And e-readers are basically like the large print of the future. I mean, the large print book business is going to go away because you can just make it as big as you want. So I'm reading Sweet Tooth, Wolf Hall, which I'm reading with a friend of mine, another writer. We both are in that awful period where we've just finished a book, and you just feel out of sorts. And so writer Jennifer Vanderbest, who's an old friend of mine, and so she lives in New York, and we basically just picked a book to read together and talk about. And now she's not reading it, which pisses me off. I call her last night, I'm like, listen, like, this book is really I'm not so sure about it. Now you're not reading it, right? There was a third title I was reading. I forget what I did. Yeah. But my taste, they kind of spring around, but in general they are quite literary. I mean, Wolf Hall and Ian McEwen, that's kind of where I am. Yes, sir.
Often when I'm writing or reading something I just wrote, I hear a voice telling me to do something different or questioning.
Do you ever hear those voices just like when you're in the supermarket? Do you see people? Right there? I'm sorry, go ahead. Keep talking.
Now I forgot.
You hear voices
there is a
saying,
voice.
must kill. No, you hear voices.
It's telling me I'm doing something wrong or silly.
Right.
It's not usually saying do this, it's usually questioning what I have done. But often there's an argument back in there. It's not just one voice I hear. Am I crazy or?
Yes, very much. I mean, the question here is, there's different kind of voices one hears, and some of them require, extensive medication, institutionalization. But there's a voice called your inner critic, which you have to be very careful about. And I listened to my inner critic for a long time, and it has mostly to do, and this is okay, you're in an MFA program. This is the danger of MFA programs, which is that there could be a kind of pack mentality where there's only a certain thing that's appropriate to write, and you have to resist that. I was a victim of the 80s love of minimalism. I showed up at Iowa in 1987. I actually didn't know I was going to school. This is kind of odd, but I didn't know what the MFA was a degree. I went to Harvard and I majored in English and read everything ever written. To be honest, I was incredibly well read by the time I was 22 because of the program that I did. I became a high school teacher for a couple of years, basically just as a way of living in different places. I lived in Hawaii and California, but I hated being a high school teacher. It's way too much work, and you don't have enough money to buy pants. It's terrible. So I'd been something of a writer in college, but I had not written anything that was any good at all. I actually got my lowest grade in English and creative writing in college. I got a C+, right, from Mary Robeson. I noticed none of you knew who she was. But I wanted to write in some way, and so I wrote a bunch of short stories. And my sister had given me a copy of the Best American Short Stories of 1985 for Christmas, right? And there were some great stories in there. Ethan Cannon's Emperor of the Air was one that made a big impression on me, and Peter Weinke's The Piano Tuner, and whatever. It was just it was a great book of wonderful stories. I had read very little contemporary fiction in college. I'd read all the stuff by all the dead people, and I'd read it really well. I mean, I didn't just read the Canterbury Tales. I read all of Chaucer. I mean, I was really well read. Okay, for my general examination for my majors, the special major, they just gave you quotations of things scattered from anywhere in English and American literature, and I got them all right. I knew what they were. I was like, I didn't know that was Chaucer. I knew that was Parliament of Fowls. I knew that was the scene in Moll Flanders when she plays the piano. I mean, I was dead on. but I'd read almost no contemporary short fiction at all, and except for John Cheever, whom I loved, and was only sort of contemporary at that point. I mean, he died just a few years later. So she gave me this book, and I looked in the back, and a lot of these people had done something in Iowa. You know, there's this thing in Iowa, really. And it was graduate school, and I figured out that maybe I could get some money to go there, and I wouldn't teach, or I wouldn't have to be a high school teacher. Like, this was just a way of like doing something else for a couple of years. And so I called Iowa, and I said, "So you have like a school for writers?" And stuff like that. And can you send me the information? And they said, "Sure." And I said, "And listen, while you're at it, are there any other schools like that? You know, that are good?" And I was talking to like the secretary of the department or something. She's like, "What?" And I said, "Well, did you recommend applying to any other schools like you?" And she's like, she rattled off a list. She's like, "I don't know, I think there's one in here." And I'm like, "Okay, all right." And I applied to all of them. Right, whatever she said, I just applied to them. And so I ended up at Iowa, where everybody was very, I mean, I was a Harvard grad. I should have been one of those sophisticated guys, but I actually wasn't. I was sort of an ingenue about what it is that we were all actually doing there. And everybody was under the sway of these sort of pared down minimalist short stories, whereas I just wanted to write the living hell out of every sentence. You know, I really wanted to. I like big narrative. The first short story I turned in was 78 pages long. People were like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "I don't know. It's just like how it came out." You know, it was my first publication too. Right, it won a prize and it was published in the literary magazine at Cornell. So there is that voice called your inner critic. And unfortunately, your inner critic can become your outer critic once you start publishing. Somebody will tell you that your work sucks, right? It's guaranteed. It took me a while, but eventually, you know, I did get that. I mean, The Passage and The 12 got tons of love, you know, best of lists and all that stuff. But boy, Janet Maslin hates me, right? And that just happens, and you have to learn to deal with that. And I wrote The Passage because my inner critic was not in anywhere evident when I started it. Wasn't anywhere evident, because I started The Passage on a dare from my kid. Have people heard this story? Some people have heard it, yeah. Basically, I wrote The Passage because my daughter came to me and said, I'm worried, I think your books may be boring. She was in the 3rd grade, and so I was comforted somewhat by the fact that she had not read them. But I said, okay, you're so smart. That's what do you want me to write about? She said, I think you should write a story about a girl who saves the world. And I said, okay, fine, you have to help me. And as a game, I would pick her up at work every day. I'd pick her up at school every day in my running clothes. She would get her bike, and we would kind of go for like 6-8 miles through the neighborhood. I was running a lot then. And just sort of play, like, let's build a story together. And it had only a couple rules, and one of them was it had to have a character with red hair, because she's a redhead. Another one was it had to be interesting. Like, nothing in it could be, if it's not interesting, it doesn't go out. If it's interesting, it gets to stay. That was it. That was the one standard. And so I went back to the stories that I really loved when I was young. I was, you know, people call it a vampire novel or zombie novel. It's not. It's an end-of-the-world story. I was obsessed with end-of-the-world novels as a kid because I was born in, like, 3 weeks before the Cuban Missile Crisis. I grew up absolutely convinced I was going to be incinerated before I was an adult. And so that was the story that I wrote with her. And we worked out an outline. It took 3 months. Pretty much the story is that outline, you know. But it was, you know, people think you wrote a story, you know, where 1 billion people die, and you did that with your 9-year-old? Like, are you the worst parent ever? And the truth is, it was an abstraction to her. Like, I was like, okay, so there are like these monsters everywhere. She's like, oh, good, monsters are interesting. You know, like, that was it. And I'll tell you, my inner critic was not on because I was just hanging out with my kid. I had no intention of writing it. And I was just kind of helping her improve her bike riding skills, which were very bad, actually. And my wife had just gone back into the workforce, and I had to find something to do with her for 2 hours after school. So, you know, no inner critic, no expectations. Nobody's saying, like, this is due on Friday. Nobody's saying, I don't know, Justin, really, should you really be doing that? Like, that's, you know, really? You're a college professor. What will people think? None of it. And then I sat down, I liked it, and I wrote it, and it turned out to be, I was worried that I would write it differently. I was like, well, you know, am I suddenly writing a commercial writer? Do I have to write like those really stupid sentences? And I quickly discovered that you write how you write. I couldn't write differently if I tried. You know, I had to learn to write new things. I had to learn to write like a large action scene. I'd never written that. All my novels were full of people talking to each other over the kitchen table, right? So I had to write a scene with a runaway train. In fact, 2 runaway trains in the first book because runaway trains are interesting, and I like them. So I did it twice. And so I had to learn how to write that stuff and find a whole new like rhetorical strategy for doing that. I had to study Dickens a lot to write the books, because, especially the second one, because of the way the character. Basically, the second book. Has anybody read The 12 yet? Right. It's a novel about putting the band back together. Right. It's about getting everybody in one place at one time. Like it's a giant and complicated plot with years of history in it that basically gets everything, every person, every story, every piece of the past, every piece of the present in one place at one moment, right? And Dickens is the guy who knew how to do that, right? It was a big project. I wanted to do it. I mean, every time I read a book, I'm like, this is this thing I'm going to go fail at and have a good time failing at it, right? And that was the program, right? The Passage, I just wanted to write a book that was so much longer than any book ever written by any of my friends that I could just, I just would look cooler. One more and then we're out here? Yes, ma'am.
Speaking of the story's deep well of gravity, speaking of The Passage in the 12, where there are so many marbles,
Yeah.
do you find that mapping is useful, or do you just take notes as you go and try to somehow organize it as you're going?
Okay, here's the problem. The problem is you have to hold the whole thing in your head. It's true. Now, I do a lot of data. I do a lot of research. I compile a lot of facts. I'm in the planning stage, to be honest, for my third book. Don't tell my editor. He thinks I'm way down the road, but I'm not. And I filled between 5 and 10 legal pads. Will just like writing. I just go on and write every day. I'm like this, ideas. It's just total free chaos, right? And from this, the final outline, it's about there. I've got one. You have to work out not just the ideas of the book, but the time, space, and action shit. Like, how do I get people from here to there in the right amount of time? Would this make sense? Would she know this? Would he know that? I mean, it's like one of those big LSAT problems that I was never good at. You get 5 canoes, and Barney will go with Fred, but not with Wilma, this stuff is awful, okay? And it's like, this is the stuff that can plunge me into outright despair with suicidal ideation. But you have to figure that stuff out in advance if you're going to write a novel that works, that has a plot, a lot of action, and a lot of characters. Otherwise, the whole thing will just blow apart. And I've read so many books like that where I'm like, you didn't figure out how this thing was going to end before you started it. The end of any novel, the beginning of any novel must know its end. Okay? I'm serious. Like, that's the one piece of advice I can give you. Because you are the story's local god, right? You are the god of this miniature cosmos. You exist outside of time and space, above this story. And the only way that story will be well told if you have divine omniscience of the whole thing, period. Right? Have you ever heard anybody tell a really great joke? Like, you can't believe how well they tell that joke. That is like their joke. They can kill the room with that joke. You know why? Because they know the punchline before they start it. Right? So they can pace it. They know which details going. They know how to do it. So know the end. So, what the hell was your question? I forgot. No, something about the deep well.
You have some.
Notes and planning things. Yeah. No. Yeah. I plan a lot. I am aware of what really holds the thing together. Right. I mean, and it's always in the title. I don't hide it. The passage, the idea of the 10 different meanings of a passage and the 7 different physical manifestations of a passage in the book, like, they're all there. If you don't know the title of your book before you start writing it, don't write it yet. Okay, if you don't know the title, it's like, it's like not knowing the name of the person you've been sleeping with for 6 months. Okay. And you are, again? It's an awkward moment, isn't it? Strangers with benefits. I don't know, it's bad. Okay? So I always put it in the title, and I know what it is. The first one was The Passage, which refers to a million different things, including physical journeys, passage of the soul from life into death, physical journey across the West, the corridor that they find at the end of the book, blah, blah, blah. There's like 18 different passages. Okay? The 12 is a book about families. It's a book about families, right? And it's a reference, of course, to the apostles. You kind of can't miss that. But they, as I said, a book about getting the band back together. Okay, it's about families being assembled, being pulled apart, and then reuniting. Okay, so that's the meaning of the story of the 12, and it's full of actual 12s. Like, there are 12s in there you can't even see. Like, the alert reader will be like, "Holy shit, there's another 12!" Right? Go on a 12 hunt in that book. Okay. Yeah, I mean, and the whole thing is leading towards, I know the end of the third book because I have to. It's a trilogy. It's one big story. At the end of the third book, you find out what the real 12 is. Okay? Right? And you have to know this stuff. At least I do. If you're going to write a book that has a plot, okay? Plot is all about convergence. right? It is. Every plot is about getting things that were apart together, right? Right? Where all those things that are operating on each other across a big web, all of a sudden they interact with each other very directly. That's what's conventionally known as climax, people, right? And that's what a novel is. That's what a novel does. And you got to plan it. It's like launching a missile. You know, if you don't aim it, you will kill all your friends in England. Okay, like you got to aim it before you launch it, right? You can't adjust it in flight that much. And if you try, you lose months of time, and your kids are crying, and your spouse is angry at you, and like you missed a mortgage payment. It's bad. Okay, go write unplanned short stories because all you do is ruin a month. Right? There's another hand. Yeah.
Yeah, but some people said that if you plan too much, you lose that unconscious level of the
No,
story.
I'm full of shit. No, because it's like jazz, right? It's like jazz. If you know the melodic line, you got lots of room to improvise along the way, right? A lot of good stuff. All the unconscious, like the little stuff comes up, man, it's great if you know where you're going. If you know where you're going, and it's like, you know, if somebody drops you in the middle of a lake, you'll drown unless you start swimming towards one point on shore. Pick a point and swim for it, okay? And along the way, a lot can happen. You have a lot of room to move, right? But what you've got is a series of local goals that you can swim toward, right? That will get the book done, right? I did a visiting gig at a college a number of years ago, and it's clearly there was not that much. There are many exciting entertainments in Lincoln, Nebraska on a Tuesday night because there were like 10 people in the room. But it was a reading series at a college that a friend of mine worked at, and a young lady got up after the reading and said, "So I've been asking the same question of every writer: how do you write a novel? How do you really do it?" And I said, "Well, what have the other people said?" And she said, "Well, there was a writer here 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, and it was somebody that I know, so I won't say who it is, right? And she said, all you have to do is sit down and start." And I said, that's a nice answer, but it's totally wrong. All you have to do is sit down and finish.